Welcome to today's DGAP Morning Briefing on the military situation in Ukraine and Russian attempts to increase the pressure on Ukraine's partners and supporters. My name is Aylin Matlé. I am a research fellow at the DGAP Security and Defense Program. Today, we will address the developments of the military situation in Ukraine in itself, including the declared end of Russia's mobilization, which Putin had announced in late September. Furthermore, today's briefing will also deal with the impact of the escalation that is taking part in other dimensions, such as Russia's withdrawal from the Istanbul Agreement on the export of agricultural products and its attacks against Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure. Luckily, I am sharing the panel today with two excellent speakers, András, who's a senior fellow at the International Order and Democracy program here at DGAP, and Alexandra Prokopenko, who's an independent analyst on Russia's policymaking on economic and financial issues. Both of them will engage in the assessment and analyses necessary. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm very happy that you're here with us. Just a brief reminder in terms of housekeeping with regard to the structure of our meeting. Each speaker has about 10 to 15 minutes for an initial input. Then we will turn over to you, the audience, to the Q&A session, which I hope you will be engaging in. You can engage by writing your question in the chat box or by using the raise hand function. We will end sharply at 9:30, and so we have about an hour now for our discussion. We'll start with András. András, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us today morning. And as usual, it's kind of a tradition already with the DGAP morning briefings. Please allow me to share a map. As usual, we are going to use the maps provided by the Institute for the Study of War. Now you are supposed to see the map. You see the map, good. So basically, since we have met last time personally in the morning briefings, the military situation on the front lines did not change decisively due to a number of reasons. First and foremost, the period of the autumn rains has set in, and as the rains soften the ground, soften the unpaved roads, this slows down any offensive operations. Second, Russia's fourth generation efforts manifested mostly in the partial mobilization. This fourth generation efforts already brought the first larger formations to the front line, and albeit these units are inexperienced, improperly trained, sometimes very badly equipped, still their numbers help the Russian command to stabilize its hold on the currently occupied territories. If we go a bit into the details, this is the situation in the Kharkiv region. Most of the fighting has been going on, still I'm pointing with the mouse, along the Svatove-Kreminov section, where Ukraine is attempting to sever basically these ground lines of communication, either sever them by occupying them or by getting them at least into artillery range. If we go down further south to the Donbas front, Russia keeps pushing for occupying the most possible territories of the Donbas. Here we have a more detailed map. The interesting element is that despite all the efforts and resources put into the fight in Donbass, Russia hasn't gained here any major or significant territories in this region, basically since July. So there's a terrible bloodshed going on, both from the Russian side and from the Ukrainian side. Still, Ukraine largely manages to hold the front line, and the four most important cities of the Donbass, the fortified cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, and Bakhmut, are still firmly in Ukrainian hands. Moreover, around Bakhmut, Ukraine even managed to get back some smaller territories from Russia's Wagner group fighting there. So the situation is largely stable, both in the Kharkiv dimension and the Donbas dimension. And if we go back to the west, to the Kherson region, we see that Russia here is preparing basically for urban fighting in the city of Kherson. They are constructing fortifications. They are moving in mostly freshly recruited troops. So it looks like that Russia is not planning to give up the city without a fight. Instead, they might try to turn Kherson into some kind of a Lysychansk #2 or some kind of a Severodonetsk #2, so to slow down and preferably bleed out the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine apparently is not in a hurry to storm the city. Instead, Ukrainian army has been continuing its very well-designed, careful, slow and meticulous interdiction campaign aimed at destroying Russia's warehouses, supply lines, and basically all the ways and means how Russia could supply its forces on the western part, or the western side of River Dnipro. When it comes to not the land front lines, but to the sea, one of the most important developments of the past few days has been the drone attack on Russia's Black Sea fleet, conducted both by aerial vehicles and also by unmanned sea vehicles, unmanned basically ships. This was a major blow to Russia, both in terms of prestige and also in terms of the very security of the Black Sea fleet. I mean, we witnessed a quite ironic period. Some 2 days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin conditioned the continuation of the Istanbul Agreement to Ukraine's guarantee to the security of the Black Sea fleet. I mean, just to repeat, Putin demanded Ukraine to guarantee the security of the Black Sea fleet. This indicates how vulnerable Russia's Black Sea fleet has become to Ukraine's attacks, and this is actually good news. Most of the major surface combatants of the Black Sea fleet have actually been withdrawn from Sevastopol since then to the further east, to the Novorossiysk military port. An interesting fact or element about the attack on the Black Sea fleet: initially, when the attack happened, Russia claimed that this was a terrorist attack against the ships of the Black Sea fleet. In reality, however, some of the ships attacked, including the frigate Admiral Makarov, has been actively participating in attacking Ukraine's military targets. So this was not a terrorist attack at all. Instead, ships of the Black Sea fleet constitute fully legitimate military target in an ongoing war. We will see to what extent Russia will be able to maintain its naval presence in the western basin of the Black Sea fleet, particularly taking into account these new Ukrainian capabilities of unmanned sea drones. Aylin already mentioned that Russia officially declared that the partial mobilization is over. Alexandra will talk a lot more about that in detail. So here I'm just adding 2-3 short points. Even though officially the mobilization is over, in reality, there are signs that Russia still goes on recruiting soldiers in certain regions. One of the reasons, however, why Putin had to declare that the mobilization was over, because from 1st of November, Russia is starting the autumn conscription cycle. You all know it very well. Russia still maintains a conscription system. Every spring and every autumn, they recruit around 120,000, 130,000 young men to the Russian army to serve basically for 1 year. The autumn conscription cycle was supposed to start earlier in the autumn from 1st of October, but because of the mobilization, they postponed the whole cycle, so they start from 1st of November on. It can be expected that the Russian mobilization system or recruitment system will be able to manage the conscription more or less in order, more or less in an orderly manner. Anyways, this is a much more organized and much more centralized process than the mobilization was. So conscription itself is highly likely to go on as planned. However, the fact that there are freshly mobilized troops in the system, and now there also will be conscripts in the system, this will massively overstretch Russia's capabilities to actually train these forces. In Russia, remember, training is such a problem that the conscripts who were recruited in the spring, 132,000 or something like this, Russia had such a lack of trainers that the spring conscripts were mostly trained by the conscripts who were recruited on the previous autumn. So the combination of conscription and mobilization is likely to further stretch Russia's ability to properly train these soldiers. Russia is already relying on Belarus in assisting the training of their soldiers. This reliance is likely to go on even more. However, when it comes to Belarus, there are still no signs that Belarus would actually plan to join the war by sending its troops to Ukraine. There's a lot of information operations going on, conducted both by Russia and Belarus, aimed at scaring Ukraine, aimed at forcing Ukraine to keep significant troops along the country's northern border. However, in reality, the Belarusian army is still not fit, not able, not willing, and not properly positioned to attack Ukraine. Moreover, Russia is shipping out significant amounts of equipment from Belarus. More than 65,000 tons of artillery ammunition have already been shipped out of Belarus. Hundreds of armored vehicles have been shipped out of Belarus. Moreover, just a few days ago, there was the first Belarusian helicopter shot down in Ukraine, or a helicopter originally used by Belarus and then handed over to Russian forces. So the equipment and ammunition of the Belarusian army is gradually getting moved or transferred to the Russian army, and then the Russian army uses it in Ukraine. And this leads to the point that it's highly unlikely that such a country would go to war, namely Belarus, which has actually its ammunition and weapons getting out of the country. Usually when a country is preparing to go to war, it's the opposite what's happening. So the country is accumulating ammunition and weapons, not shipping them out. So in the short and medium run, it's still unlikely that Belarus would join the fight. Last point from my side, when it comes to equipment and ammunition, there are more and more news about additional Iranian drones getting shipped to Russia, and not only drones, but also ballistic missiles. On the 1st of November, spokesperson of Ukraine's Air Force, Colonel Ignat, openly said that if the ballistic missiles appear on the front line, Ukraine will be in deep trouble, because against the ballistic missiles, Ukraine has no efficient defense. Ukraine's air defense system has been designed, built up, and strengthened in the last 8 months to take down slow-moving aerial targets, drones, and aircrafts and helicopters. Ballistic missiles, however, travel several times the speed of sound. Providing any kind of defense against them would require quite of a different air defense system compared to the one that Ukraine has now. So once Iranian Iranian ballistic missiles appear on the front line, the strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure are likely to get a lot more intensive. So Russia is bringing in weapons from Belarus, bringing in drones and missiles from Iran. Moreover, just yesterday morning, the US published intelligence information according to which North Korea is already supplying Russia with artillery shells and ammunition. This kind of import of weapons and ammunition from abroad indicate that Russia is suffering from a significant shortage of weapons and ammunition. So this is one thing. But on the other hand, these imports also indicate that Russia is preparing for a long war. And despite the domestic shortages of ammunition, thanks to these imports, particularly from North Korea, Russia might well be able to maintain the current intensity of the fighting for several months, possibly even a year more. I mean, North Korea has immense supplies of artillery ammunition, and most of the North Korean artillery systems, particularly the elder ones, are fully compatible with Russia's ex-Soviet systems. So a lot depends on the amounts and conditions of how much ammunition North Korea is going to deliver to Russia. And this raises a question which I'm not able to answer. I just see the question mark, whether the import from North Korea could take place without at least the tacit consent of China. I'm not sure. My gut feeling is that the fact that North Korea started to ship ammunition to Russia, this is something which requires at least a silent agreement of the Chinese side. Hopefully we will get to know a lot more information about that. So my 12 minutes are coming to an end. I'm stopping the sharing now. Thank you once again. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to try to answer either personally or in the chat. Over.
Thank you very much, András, for kicking us off this morning with a very thorough analysis and overview on the situation on the ground and what we might be expecting in the weeks and months ahead. While I know that Alexandra will also touch upon the topic of partial mobilization, or rather the declared end of it, I have just a very brief and short follow-up question to András, or maybe Alexandra, if you want to cover that as well. I'm happy to hear from you too on your assessment of how many of the mobilized troops have already arrived on the battleground, and whether you think or whether you can make the assessment if they are making any difference on the ground with regards to the actual movement on the ground and the way and the direction the war is heading into.
According to official Russian information, slightly more than 80,000 have been deployed already to Ukraine. It's not possible to define, however, that what does it mean to Ukraine. So actually to the front line, somewhere to the occupied regions, somewhere to regions deep behind the front line. This I cannot tell from open sources. Based on the information we have so far on the use of the mobilized troops, their overall combat value is very, very low, due to at least 4 main problems. First, morale. These men don't want to be there. I mean, the ones who wanted to be there already volunteered for the Russian army. Second, equipment. Russian army is suffering from the problems of equipping so many mobilized men. Anyways, there has not been mobilization in Russia ever since the end of the Second World War. They just don't have the proper equipment necessary for gearing up 300,000 more men. Third, training, as I described already. I mean, partial mobilization was ordered on the 21st of September in order to have or to provide the mobilized men with just a very basic infantry training, very basic rifleman training, if you like. Provided that the person already served in the military, so you only need to refresh his knowledge. The minimum time necessary for a proper training is 4 to 6 weeks. And many of the troops have already been deployed way before that. So training is the third problem, and the fourth, leadership. Russia doesn't have the necessary number of officers and non-commissioned officers to properly lead these mobilized soldiers. However, bad news from this perspective, time looks like probably works for Russia, because as time goes by, they will probably be able to consolidate the use of the mobilized forces. Yes, this is going to come with high losses. Some losses already occurred among mobilized men, but Russia has factored in these losses. They calculated these losses. They are ready to live with it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for answering my quick follow-on question. Now, Alexandra, we're very happy to hear from you, and especially for you to shed a bit of light on Russia's stance on the Istanbul agreement, what's going on there, and also Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure systems.
Hi, and thanks for having me here. I first will start with sharing my thoughts about the grain deal. Then I have some injection about mobilization, and then maybe if we have time, I will talk about Russian attacks on infrastructure. So, as you all know, yesterday Russia rejoined the grain deal, and that's from my perspective, that's the big victory of Turkish President Erdogan. In winners and losers term, Erdogan is a winner and Putin is a loser. So I feel that Putin has always viewed the deal as a political tool because benefits for Russia from this deal were quite modest. So why it's a very good question why Putin decided to use this tool right now, and maybe the reason is what Russia said, that Ukraine used this grain corridor to attack Black Sea Fleet, and to me is a big question why the Second World Army wasn't prepared to repeal this attack. Coming back to the grain deal, Erdogan, from my perspective, Erdogan's leverage on the Putin was more powerful. There is no visible evidence of Russian success in this deal. Written guarantees from Ukraine, which Russia demanded, doesn't seem as something big and something significant. It's interesting to point that Russia always Russia expressed its unhappiness about the deal since September, and according to Putin, it was a problem that the destination of the grain was what rich countries, especially European unions, which so-called in Russia right now unfriendly countries, but not the poorest countries in the world. But to the deal really, how the deal is connected to the world starvation problem? Basically only through the food prices, because the destination of grain wasn't never was a part of the deal, and when Russia says that it's a responsible supplier of the poorest world, we need to keep in mind that Russia can supply the poorest countries with the grain without a deal. And it's all about the narrative surrounding the deal about this connection between poorest countries and the Ukrainian export. Russia just used it, but also Russia used, the real reasons, I think, was Russian concern of so-called hidden sanctions. Putin once told, and a couple of times a Minister of Foreign Affairs pointed that Russian exporters, Russian agricultural exporters and Russian fertilizers exporters struggle with international transactions, insurances, and fracht vessels. So basically, there were two questions concerned, Russia concerned with that big amount of fertilizers were blocked in the Baltic ports. And I want to remind you the discussion, the September discussion about renewal of Ammiak pipeline to Odessa. And the interesting detail about this pipeline is that it's mostly filled by fertilizers from the enterprise belong to closest Putin ally, Arkady Rotenberg. And yesterday I saw comments from the Turkish side which said that maybe Russia will have some additional preferences after rejoining the deal, and we need to keep following, and maybe these preferences are related to these fertilizers cases. But back to Erdogan, as I said, I feel that it was his big win, and Erdogan moved Putin back to the deal quite quickly. Why that happened? That I think that since the war started, Turkey has developed significant leverage over Russia, and I think that that was some sort of Putin miscalculation. Russia badly needs to import chips and equipment from Turkey, and as we see from available data, and it's Turkish data because Russian data is closed, that after the loss of European export and imports, Russia significantly raised its from Turkey. And this also valid about the gas hub that Putin and Erdogan are discussing. The gas hub is more necessary for Russia than to Turkey. According to the statistics, Turkey became a third Russian trade partner. It was last year, it was only 11. In September, Turkey increases its export, and it hits a new record. It's 20% up to August, and it's break $1 billion. $1 billion of dollars. It's 2 times more than the year ago. Well, of course, this war and the Russian isolation benefits Turkey. After all, Turkey is now Russia's main window to Europe in terms of tourism, in terms of well. At least only Turkey and Serbia, there are only 2 destinations Russians can fly to Europe or to the States. There is no direct flights from Russia yet. Kremlin and propaganda like to say that this raising collaboration with Turkey is indicates that Russia is not isolated, but it's partly true. The higher it depends on Turkey for trade, the lower the economic sovereignty that Putin is so proud of. And I think Erdogan used economic leverage to bring Putin back to the deal. Putin so desperately needs the Turkish market that Erdogan can dictate his terms and ask for significant discounts, as we already saw with gas prices. Another thing I want to point that Russian so-called patriotic part of society were very unhappy with rejoining the deal. Yesterday, there were lots of comments on internet from so-called voyenkore, military journalists and so-called hawkish internet I'm calling them internet warriors, but they create really significant noise, ultra-patriotic noise, and demanding Putin and military leadership to escalate. That they were really unhappy with the deal, and they and a couple of times, and they repeatedly saying that Russian rejoining the deal shows Russian weakness, not strength. So it's very interesting to think what will happen with the deal after the 18th of November, the last day of the deal. And from my perspective, I think that Erdogan will put lots of effort to continue the deal, because, well, it shows Erdogan as a really good mediator and as a powerful man who can influence Putin without nuclear weapons. And also in terms of economy, in terms of economics, Turkey is one of big beneficiaries of this deal. Then, well, jumping from the grain deal to mobilization, I'm just putting some technical details that, as András already noticed, that mobilization was over, but not so over, and it's on it's very important to that it should be over with the Putin's decree. The same way as it was started, because, well, of course, they declared that the mobilization was over, so they stopped grabbing people from the streets and bring them to military commissariats. But for military, the mobilization means that their short-term contract become timeless. And that means that people who already served in the army, they can leave. They cannot. They cannot leave. They cannot drop a service. And these guys are trained. And well, there were a big number of complaints from them that before the mobilization, they need to serve 1 month or maybe a couple of weeks until the end of their contract. But because of mobilization, the contract become timeless, and without any special permissions, they cannot leave the service. And that's a disaster. And that's a big amount of people. That's thousands of people. And the polls show that after the mobilization were announced, polls showed the growing concerns within Russian society about mobilization, and people were very unhappy with that. So that's why I think the authorities announced that mobilization was over. So they're using some sort of propaganda tool without real ending of mobilization. And of course, the so-called extra conscription can be renewed in December or in January without any extra decrees from the leadership, and that's well, that's the thing we need to follow. And speaking about Russian attacks on Ukraine energy infrastructure, my short comment is that that's sort of a pattern of General Surovikin. That's the way he used to. That's his waves to make the war he used to do in Syria. And even before he was put on his place, there were rumors that, well, of course, Russian military leadership will bring General Surovikin, who will attack energy infrastructure and some and other peaceful infrastructure that will push Ukrainian society to force its leadership to stop the war. So I don't think that it is the it is the major tactics, but the sideline, maybe that's the reason. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your very insightful comments and your analysis. I have a very short follow-up question for you as well before I open up the discussion for the audience. You mentioned Erdogan's role in bringing back Putin into the Crimea, which I find quite fascinating, given that not too long ago, the power balance between Putin and Erdogan seemed to be the exact opposite. So my question is, do you think that Erdogan will try to renew and give another push to facilitate talks or possibly even negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in the near future?
I think it is possible. The probability of that isn't zero. But I need to, so here, speaking about Erdogan, we always need to remember that he is extremely powerful regional leader. He's He has interests in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, in conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in Caucasus region, and with his idea of so-called pan-Turkism, he funding schools even in Russia, in Tatarstan, and in the Yakutia region, and Russia is dealing with this. So in Russia, respect. I don't know with the goodwill or not the interests of Erdogan in the region and in the world. So I think Erdogan would be happy to bring both Putin and Mr. Zelensky to the table for the peace talks, but it depends not only from Putin and not only from Zelensky. I think solemnly, and only Erdogan couldn't do this. Erdogan couldn't do this alone, and that should be a large international effort with the other world leaders who have leverage over Putin. That can be, I think, Xi mediation, or maybe U.S. will find someone in Russian administration to talk about this.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for answering my question. Now it's the floor is open to the audience, as my colleague already posted in the chat box. Write your questions either in the chat box itself or use the raising hand function if you either want to comment on something that's been said, or if you want to pose a question to both or one of our panelists. I see that we have a person wanting to ask a question already, so please open your microphone and introduce yourself.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting briefing. I have two questions. One regarding the dismissal of General Lapin, who was sharply criticized by Prigozhin and Kadyrov. How you assess this? And second, you read a lot about sabotage acts conducted on Russian soil. How do you evaluate this regarding the morale of Russian troops? Thank you.
Would you like to answer the question first, and then we will move on to other questions?
I can try. Thanks. When it comes to the dismissal of General Lapin, there has been, rotating commanders on the front line. It's more or less normal. And how the Russian, or based on what criteria, does the Russian leadership assess the performance of one general or another general? This is not something that that one can rely or one can assess from open sources. So I try to answer the second part of the question, the criticism coming from Kadyrov and also Mr. Prigozhin. The interesting thing that has been going on in the Russian media space already for months is that both Kadyrov and Prigozhin are sharply criticizing the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian Armed Forces, sometimes Minister Shoigu personally. And comes the question, why? This question comes because, in fact, both Kadyrov's troops and particularly Prigozhin's troops, the Wagner group, are 100% dependent on the Russian army and on the Russian general staff. That's where they get their intelligence. That's where they get their logistics. That's where they get their medevac capabilities. That's from where they get all their ammunition, everything. So I'm not really ready to believe that this is a genuine criticism. My impression on this kind of large hassle between Kadyrov and the Ministry of Defense, Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense, amplified by the military bloggers, or Vayankore, like mentioned by Alexandra, so amplified by the military bloggers, this whole thing looks for me like something that is perfectly orchestrated. This is an information operation, in my opinion, conducted in the Russian media space with the objective of diverting the responsibility from Putin to Shoigu. So to shape the Russian public opinion in such a way that for all the failures, for all the losses, the Russian public would blame the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff, but not the president. So all this criticism from Wagner to the Ministry of Defense and all this large media noise, which should not happen in the super centralized Russian media space, had there been no central will to let it happen, this whole noise, or we may call it a circus, this reminds me of a large-scale, properly conducted information operation. So I wouldn't give too much importance to the criticism or kind of criticism coming either from Kadyrov or from Prigozhin. When it comes to the sabotage and the morale of the Russian troops, this is again something that is hard to measure. However, so far, I'm not aware of any data that Russian troops inside Russia would have faced discipline problems due to sabotage. They have discipline problems due to the delay of payment, due to bad equipment, due to bad conditions, but not due to sabotage. This might come in a later moment. So far, I'm not aware that this happened. I hope this helps. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a short injection about the role of Kadyrov and Prigozhin and the so-called media noise they are creating. It's not so they're real critics of the Ministry of Defense, and as András completely pointed that they are dependent on Ministry of Defense. But why they're doing this? It's because they're trying to increase their to create the myth that they are more influential than they are, that if they are commenting the military leadership, if they are criticizing military leadership, that they are so sharp, that they are so good that they can come to Putin and influence Putin. That's what they're trying to, that's the myth they're trying to create. And it's not, and unfortunately, I need to admit that they are successful because Russian media and also Western media are trying to write to them about writing about them in terms of their hawkishness and showing that they are influential to Putin, which is absolutely not true. That there is no evidence that they have direct access to Putin and direct access on decision-making process. So this noise they are creating, it's so they're ballooning themselves and trying to show that they have more influence than they really really obtain.
So we have one more question from the audience directly and two questions in the chat box. I'd first like to give the person in the live audience an opportunity to pose their question.
Yeah, hi, I'm sorry, I'm boarding. I hope, please excuse the background noise. One question to András regarding the capability of the Ukraine to rebuild their energy infrastructure. How do you assess that? Thank you very much.
András, would you like to go first, and then we turn to the questions in the chat box?
I can try, sure. However, I need to admit I'm not an energy infrastructure expert, so here I'm just scratching the surface. The problem with the Russian attacks is not only their geographical scope. A lot more problematic is that they are hitting particular transformator station or transformer stations, and these transformer stations in the high electricity grid. These transformer stations are individually made devices. So it's not like that you switch it on, put in a new one, switch it back. You have to individually build up each and every transformer station to the given local circumstances. This is a very complicated process and also very, very expensive. I mean, we speak here about millions of euros for replacing just one such station, or hundreds of thousands of euros. So first, the reparations are extremely costly. Second, Ukraine's energy infrastructure and the maintenance crew has been built up for peacetime. I mean, Ukraine's largest private energy company, the DTEC, regularly complains that they are operating at a minimum personnel. because the whole company has not been prepared for repairing wartime damages. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of scale and also in terms of diversity. I mean, how large territories of Ukraine are hit. I mean, just be frank, every region of Ukraine has been regularly hit except of the Zakarpattia region, so the Transcarpathian region. Transcarpathia was hit only once. Perhaps the Chernivtsi region was more or less spared as well, but Russians are able to target the whole of the country. And taking into account the incoming winter as a third factor, and the steady supply of Iranian drones and later missiles, my forecast here that in the short run, Ukraine is not able to win this race. Larger and larger parts of Ukraine's energy infrastructure will get degraded, depleted, bombed, dysfunctional. And this may result in major internal migration in Ukraine and perhaps also external migration. However, the good news here that even if Ukraine may lose in the energy infrastructure battle, again, in the short run, I'm a military historian. I cannot recall a single case from military history where attacks against the civilian population, I mean, conventional attacks against the civilian population would have forced a military leadership to give up. I mean, one may remember the massive Allied bombings against Nazi Germany during the Second World War, or Nazi Germany bombing the United Kingdom in the Blitz, or the Americans bombing North Vietnam in the Vietnam War. Still, the civilian population suffered, but the political leadership did not collapse. So here, I have a deep trust in the resilience of the Ukrainian public. Yes, people will suffer. Many people will leave their homes, but I don't see that the Ukrainian leadership would collapse because of these Russian attacks. Still, in the short run, unfortunately, I don't see that Ukraine could keep up with the Russian damages inflicted on her energy infrastructure. So that's bad news here.
Thanks, András. We have a few questions in the chat box now, some of which I would like to bundle and direct at the two of you. Firstly, there's a question that reads, what has been presented about Turkey's role provokes the question of how that is compatible with it being a member of NATO. And then in connection to that, could you please expand on the recent article in the New York Times on Russia's allegedly ongoing plundering of Ukrainian grain under the grain deal? What is the magnitude? Is this one of Putin's Siloviki's side hustle? Maybe, Alexandra, you would like to comment on that, and then we'll move on to a third question from the chat box that is directed at both of you. What are your judgments about the Western strategic posture regarding this conflict? Is it appropriate? How imperfect is it? What needs to be done to improve it?
Well, actually, I haven't read the story in the New York Times, so I need to to check it afterwards. But there were a few, but there were stories from BBC also, and I think from Financial Times that Russia, that not Russian Siloviks, but Russian people, but not Russian troops, but Russians who came to the Ukrainian territory, that they are plundering Ukrainian grain, and well, it's possible, but it's I think that's so-called side effect of the war when someone trying to become richer and to get some extra money on this. And I think that Russian Siloviks are closing eyes on these cases if they are happening, of course. But speaking about the role of Erdogan, well, he raised his influence. I don't know about how NATO countries are happy or unhappy with the Turkey membership and how Erdogan use it. I mean, there was it was a huge scandal when he tried to block Finland and Sweden joining the NATO. And in terms of big games, well, Putin think that Erdogan was done everything right and use its influence very handy. He was very crafty in ballooning his influence within NATO, but yeah.
Great, thank you. And András, if you would like to comment on the question of the Western strategic posture regarding the conflict, Russia's war against Ukraine.
Thank you. See, again, I mean, judging whether a strategic posture is right or wrong, this is something not binary. This is not something we can just decide so easily. Besides, I'm not a military planner, so this is something, again, my expertise is kind of limited, so I need to say my opinion with these particular caveats. I think if you take into account the Western willingness to avoid a direct NATO-Russia war, basically at all costs, then we are on the right side of doing that. And while we are very careful, good news, Russians are also careful. While we are careful with our efforts to avoid an open NATO-Russia conflict, I mean, so far the West has been providing Ukraine with an unprecedented level of political, military, and economic support. I mean, had anybody told me a year ago that Germany would deliver high-tech weapon systems into an ongoing war, I would have surely not believed it. And still, this is what we see happening. The Iris just arriving, already fighting in Ukraine. Further batteries are on the way. So we are not doing that bad. So it's of course fashionable to criticize the West's attitude to the war. There's not enough help provided. Still, we are doing, I think, much better than we would have expected from ourselves a year ago. And if we take into account the Madrid decisions and the new NATO strategic concept, also the desire to upgrade the NATO response forces, also to switch from deterrence to denial to deterrence by punishment, sorry, other way around. These are important changes. And the good news here, when it comes to the conventional military capabilities, Russia's conventional military capabilities are rapidly degrading. I mean, Russian military bases are getting emptied. They are moving their forces from the far north, even from Kaliningrad, to fight in Ukraine. So even if the war comes to an end tomorrow, it will take 5 to 10 years for Russia to rebuild the capabilities already lost in this war, which means the West has enough time to adjust her own strategic posture to the changing circumstances. Russia's military resources are actually quite limited when it comes to both personnel and also the industrial base behind. So I think the West is doing fairly well, particularly, again, just compare the situation to how we looked like a year ago. The challenge here, however, is, and if you remember just one thing from my remark here, let it be this one. The challenge is to sustain this effort. Because Russia is preparing for a long war. In the spring, there is quite likely that there would be another major Russian offensive. We need to sustain our efforts and our commitments. And this is what I see as a real challenge.
Great. Thank you very much, András, also for answering one of the questions in the chat box that was also touching upon the question of what the West can do in response to alleged Iranian and North Korean equipment deliveries to Russia. We have now also a question in the audience. I'll take that one first, and then we have one or two more questions in the chat box. So please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. with reference to the discussion about the conflict between the Ministry of Defense and Prigozhin, I would like to ask you, there's also another conflict now going on between Prigozhin and the governor of St. Petersburg, Big Wolf. Do you think that this could be a cause for an elite split? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. No, I don't think that there is any signs of elite split. And the conflict between Prigozhin and Beglov are ongoing, and it's not new. It's the very old one. And during last elections, Prigozhin, during last governor's elections in St. Petersburg, Prigozhin set up its candidate, which completely failed at the election. So Russian state and Russian politics are very are injected with so-called informal practices. And Prigozhin were really good in that. But to be a so-called respectable person and respectable member of the elite, you need to have so-called tema or any real assets in your disposal to be respected by the other members, which Prigozhin absolutely hasn't. So his influence is not enough to oust the governor of St. Petersburg. I want to remind you that Ministry of Defense broke its contract with Prigozhin structures on food supplies, and I don't remember, was it concerned to cleaning services, but definitely for food supplies to military army. And Prigozhin wasn't powerful enough to bring this contract back to his structures. So so that's what he's doing. So right now, Prigozhin is on top, and his only real asset is his mercenaries, which are actually not so valuable in the peacetime. And the war wouldn't last forever. And one day it will end, and it will be another issue for Russian state how to deal with private armies of Prigozhin and Kadyrov. But that's the next question. But right now, what Prigozhin is trying to do, he's using his raised, as he thinks, influence to solve the problems he had before the war.
Thank you, Alexandra. I see two more questions in the chat box, which I'd like to collectively hand over to you, and then also with that close the Q&A session in light of the time that is running out. One question, I wonder if the presenters or other in the audience could provide any indication of the situation in the Black Sea. Is it secured by Turkey, other forces, and has the Russian presence in essence been neutralized? And then secondly, what is your view on the recent offering of Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia as a mediator in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict? Will both sides accept? Will this be able to take place? Whoever feels feels like answering one of those two questions, please go ahead.
Thank you. Unfortunately, my knowledge is not wide enough to assess how realistic the Cambodian proposal is. So let me try to answer partially the Black Sea Fleet question. Russia's surface combatants, so classic warships, have been pushed out from the western basin of the Black Sea Fleet, thanks to Ukraine's long-range air anti-ship missiles, unmanned naval vehicles, and also the fact that Ukraine's air force still exists and is actually able to carry on strikes against precious targets. But in naval warfare, it doesn't require your ship to be present in order to do harm. I mean, with long-range missiles and cruise missiles, Russia's Black Sea Fleet still poses an acute threat to several of Ukraine's regions, because with their caliber missiles, they can hit targets from 1,500 kilometers distance. So the fact that the Russian ships are not there in front of Odessa and not physically blocking the route of merchant ships, it doesn't mean that the Russian Navy stopped posing a threat. The grain deal will come to an end on the 22nd of November, if I'm not mistaken, because it was originally signed for 4 months. So the big question mark here I see is that after the grain deal comes to an end, how will Russia behave? Whether Russia will dare, let's say, to stop or, God forbid, attack a cargo ship carrying Ukrainian grain. Because if that happens, then the escalation burden would become a lot more different than it is right now today. Until the 22nd of November, we're good. As Alexandra explained, Russians realized that because the grain deal is going on, even without them, it's better than to step back to the deal, so re-enter the deal. But whether the deal can be extended after the 22nd of November, that's a big question mark. And if Russia decides to increase the pressure put on Ukraine's allies by not extending the grain deal, then I'm afraid that we might again see the Russian Black Sea Fleet taking action against civilian ships. And I very much hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid I'm not. Thank you.
Thank you, András. Alexandra, would you like to comment on the Cambodian offer to possibly facilitate talks between Ukraine and Russia?
Unfortunately, my expertise in Cambodian politics and in Cambodian role is also limited. I hope that any mediation in this conflict will be helpful and will bring both sides to the peace talks. But I need to remind that since the conflict was started, different leaders offered its mediation services. I mean, President Tokayev also, who is in good relations with Putin, offered his mediation, and also President of Indonesia, I think, tried. And well, last week I think we saw the news about the President of Guinea-Bissau, who traveled to Moscow and then who brought some message from Putin to Zelensky. So I think any diplomatic efforts will be helpful.
Thanks, and thanks, Alexandra. And on that sort of mixed note, I would like to conclude our morning briefing today, seeing as we've almost run out of time. Thank you very much, first of all, obviously, to our speakers today for taking the time, not only to present your initial inputs, but also to engage with the audience's questions. And then thanks to the audience for taking the time to be with us this morning. I hope that we will see you next time. And with that, I'm bidding you farewell and wishing you a nice remaining Thursday. Thank you very much.